All right, so just as a point, I'd ask that everyone please remain muted during the presentation, just so we can kind of reduce background noise. You will have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the presentation. One way to do that is you can put your questions in the chat, and Gigi will interrupt me. We'll take brief pauses throughout the presentation to take questions, and you can either put your questions in the chat and we'll read your questions aloud, or you can feel free to unmute yourself during the question breaks to ask questions. We will also have time for a longer Q&A at the end as well. So just kind of some background into this workshop. So the purpose of this workshop is to help you begin thinking about how to translate your idea into our full proposal. One assumption that we have is that you have already reviewed our grant guidelines and application questions. That doesn't mean you can't ask questions. Definitely, if you have any questions, if things are unclear to you, please feel free to ask questions throughout the proposal. So one thing, this proposal is kind of mainly geared towards our grants, that we hope it'll be useful as you are looking to apply for other funding opportunities, and the kinds of things to kind of think about as you are looking at how to translate, application questions and guidelines into a competitive proposal. Now, the overall agenda of what we're going to discuss today, one is a reminder about the UEI. Then we're going to discuss the different review proposal, the evaluation criteria that our evaluators use, kind of some considerations for them, some considerations for what makes a competitive proposal, and also discuss why proposals are not funded. So now, some of you who've applied recently may be sick of me harping on the UEI. So we're going to discuss what is the unique entity ID. Now, this is a 12-digit alphanumeric ID from sam.gov. It is free. You might be asking, why do you need one? As Karin mentioned, we are the state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are primarily supported through a federal grant, and these are technically federal grants. We're re-granting federal dollars, so a lot of the restrictions and guidelines that apply to federal grants apply to our grants. And one of those is that organizations have a unique entity ID from sam.gov to receive federal funds. You do not need to complete the full registration process. You can just have the ID assigned. However, if you're considering applying for federal funding in the future, I definitely recommend completing the full registration process. What do you need to get one? Once you go to sam.gov, you'll need your organization's legal business name. If you have a doing business as, you'll need to provide that as well. You'll need to have a physical street address. So one thing, this is something that's kind of tripped people up if they haven't gotten it, is a PO box may not be used to get your UEI. And you also need your organization's start date, state of establishment. So I know many of you organizations were started in New Jersey. So I would just recommend, if you do not have a UEI, that you would start ASAP. We are looking to have them by the application deadline. So there's a field in there for the UEI. Again, if you run into any troubles, we can work with you. I know sometimes sam.gov is delayed. So if you have started the process and it's kind of delayed, we can work with you, though we would need one before we distribute any funding. So I don't want to spend too much time on the UEI because it's not terribly interesting, though it is important. So if anyone has any questions about that, please, feel free to unmute yourself, put your questions in the chat. We can kind of discuss that. Okay, great. Now let's get into the more interesting piece of the presentation. Okay, so we're going to discuss what our proposals are reviewed for. So these are actually broadly what the criteria that our grants review committee works for. To give you some background into the process, our grants are reviewed by our they're reviewed and approved by our grants review committee. So the decisions are not made by staff. Really, my role as a staff member here is to facilitate, help guide you through the grants process, answer your questions. I do not make the final decisions on grants, and neither does Gigi or Karin. We have a grants review committee, which is made up of members of our board of trustees and also external reviewers who work in the humanities throughout New Jersey at museums, libraries, universities, other organizations, sometimes, maybe retired or, work independently. But they're all people who bring deep experience, both in the humanities and also the nonprofit cultural infrastructure in New Jersey. So the proposals are reviewed by anywhere from 4 to 5 reviewers. They come together, pluck the scores, discuss the proposals, and we create a final. They create a final funding recommendation. So I just want to give you a little bit of insight into kind of how the process for review. Now, the main categories we have are project plan and outcomes, humanities content and project team, audience and outreach, and also budget and capacity. And I'm going to break down in the next section like what all these different things entail and kind of some of the considerations that we have. Okay, so first, project plan and outcomes. One of the things that we're looking for is a realistic and well-conceived plan. I think we'll kind of get into this later. This will look often very different for an incubation grant versus an action grant. Now, as you're probably aware at this point, incubation grants are planning and development grants, while action grants are project implementation grants. And how kind of realistic and well-conceived plan would work, will kind of apply to is very different. They would apply very differently to those two grant types. We're looking for a clear timeline and outcomes identified. Again, there's going to be a difference between an incubation and action grant with this. And I think, in terms of an incubation grant, you're often like essentially creating the plan. You're in the proposal, you'll be essentially creating a plan to, in many cases, to create a plan. So, as I said, they're planning grants. So it might be an exhibit plan, a plan for reaching out and expanding your audience, for the humanities-based programming that you do as an organization. It could be a plan for a reading and discussion series. Perhaps you're looking at different program types. Perhaps you want to explore a certain subject matter and you're trying to decide, what is the best way to kind of distribute and share this information with our intended audience. And we'll discuss audience a little bit later on. So, an incubation grant plan in the proposal will essentially be a plan for often just creating a plan. And so that's kind of ties into the outcome as well. Often what we see with an incubation grant is the outcome is not going to be, the exhibit itself. It's going to be a plan to create the exhibit. It's not going to be, the public events themselves. It's going to be the sort of plan for implementing those public events. And with the action grant, we're looking for, since those are project implementation grants, we're looking for, the sort of plan for implementation. I think one thing to think about is with an incubation grant, you can have much more unanswered questions. I think often what makes a really strong incubation grant is a central question to that. Like, these questions could be, we want to work with X audience, what sort of methods of, would be the best way to go about that? Who could we connect with? What kind of ways of presenting information? What kind of programming would be appealing to that, to them? Now, looking at the action grant stage, where you're kind of at that point and have a lot more of these things figured out. You have a clear idea for your audiences. You have a clear idea of what your programming is going to be. So in that plan, it's going to be kind of more of a structured plan with clear milestones and deliverables. While, again, I said the incubation grant can be kind of a little bit more open-ended, and often the strongest incubation grant ones, there's an opportunity for the project team to kind of adjust and grow throughout the process as they learn and learn new information. In terms of the assessment, we're not looking for like a formal evaluation plan. You don't need to have a logic model. If you have one, great. But we're really looking to see, like, for whether it's the incubation grant or the action grant, like, how are you determining, what kind of questions would you want to answer to determine whether or not you're meeting your goals for this project, whether it's to have people understand, a period of a historical time period differently, or connecting with a new audience. Sort of what are the kind of questions that you would ask yourself as an organization to kind of determine the answers, to those questions. I think one thing, looking at the proposal, one thing that I see people do a lot is they focus a lot on the sort of method of collecting information or evaluating, and say, well, we're going to do a survey, which is great. It's helpful to kind of describe what kind of tools you anticipate using, but really I think what makes a really strong a question, a really strong answer for the assessment question in our proposal is really thinking about the kinds of questions that your organization is grappling with and how you would go about answering those questions, and the kinds of information that you would hope to collect, what you would hope to learn through this process, whether it's an incubation grant or an action grant. I think that's both crucial to both. So I think one thing too to consider is depth is often better than breadth. So oftentimes we see proposals where I think people say, oh, we want to do 7 different things. We want to do an exhibit. We want to do a walking tour. But oftentimes that means they're very unfocused. So I think oftentimes it's better, particularly if you have less experience in sort of running complex projects. There have been, obviously there are projects that are multifaceted that run very successfully. But I would say, like, oftentimes the strongest proposals are a bit more focused on sort of one or two different goals rather than trying to accomplish, because these are 1-year grants, and so you kind of have to be a little bit time bound, sort of thinking about what could you realistically accomplish as an organization within the next year. Also, too, given the kind of scope of funding we provide as well. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. Does anybody have any questions about this section? Do not see any questions in the chat. So feel free, if you have any questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Okay, now this is really the heart of what we do, humanities. We are a public humanities organization, so all of our projects need to be deeply engaged with the humanities. I think if you attended our previous workshop, this might be review, but I think it's helpful to think of the humanities in terms of both like disciplines and practices. So the disciplines of the humanities would be, for example, history, literature, art history, philosophy, ethics, and discipline, sort of practices of the humanities. We often think about things such as like oral history and storytelling, facilitated discussion, facilitated conversation. So we really want these projects to kind of really, as I said, be deeply engaged with the humanities. I think, one of the questions that often comes up in our work is like, how does the humanities engage with other disciplines? The most common being art, but also sometimes as well, like environmental science, or, we've also had projects from social service organizations. And so kind of how that could take place is like, you're examining, I think a good example to look at is we funded a project that was examining, it was from a public health organization. One of the things they wanted to examine was a sort of cultural factors that kind of went into place into kinds of how people perceived healthy eating. So it was trying to encourage people to kind of, I think the end goal of the organization was to encourage healthier eating habits, but they were actually looking at it not from just a scientific perspective, but also examining cultural practices and beliefs, folklore, and kind of engaging with the community to kind of figure out like what kind of cultural attitudes have shaped the population's relationships to food. So that can be one way a sort of more social service oriented project engages with the humanities. Another example, often we see this, as I mentioned, arts projects that kind of at the intersection of the arts and the humanities. I think these are often very rich projects. If your proposal is primarily about funding sort of the creation and performance of art, it's not going to be competitive. But I think if you're looking to engage within sort of a project that utilizes both the arts and the humanities, you're kind of looking at how can you use, essentially, how can you, it's using either like examining the art, like what is the cultural, social, historic context that the art was created in, that might entail some elements of performance or display of art, but you're really kind of looking beyond just the sort of the presentation and kind of thinking more deeply about what kind of questions does this art raise, or also sometimes using art as kind of a catalyst for engaging with these engaging in discussions of history, culture, values, and beliefs. And we're also really looking for projects that kind of have some complexity with how they pursue these questions and ideas, and sort of complexity and nuance, and how, and also that involves often bringing in different perspectives together and kinds of how you explore these topics. And one thing that makes proposals really competitive as well is that there's opportunities for active learning. I think, since how this might be coming up in sort of incubation grant stage, since it's not going to be really focused on programming itself, is kind of how would you kind of consider building in those opportunities as you're developing your plan for programming in the future. Now, one thing I'd like to talk about is the project team. So we're looking, so if you've applied for our grants in the past, we used to have kind of a humanities scholar requirement. We are looking for, I think this point to see kind of how different members of the project team complement each other holistically. So looking at their skills, their expertise, their experience, and kind of how to create something, create a richer whole. I think, these project team members can be internal to your organization or external. Perhaps, in your organization, you have somebody who's really well versed on a particular, you're doing a project on, Reconstruction, and you have somebody, or colonial history, and you have somebody in your team who's really knowledgeable about the history. But perhaps, you might look externally, but perhaps they're not as, well suited to, community engagement, have less experience in that. So you might want to bring somebody in from the external, externally to work on that aspect, or vice versa. Perhaps, you and your organization, you have a lot of deep experience working with the community, but you want to, do a project about a particular historical time period. So you might want to bring in a subject matter expert to complement, the staff members that you have within internally. So in terms of like who can be a project team member, we're really looking at like who is going to contribute substantially to the planning, creation, content delivery of the project. I would say if somebody is just a one-off presenter, they're not really as much a project team member. You're really looking for people who are kind of shaping the project over its lifespan. In terms of like the profiles, we kind of have like sort of three broad categories for like project team members. One would be sort of, your traditional academic humanist who has a PhD, works at a university, as teaching faculty or perhaps a researcher. Other would be what we might call a public humanist, someone who may or may not have an advanced degree in the humanities, but has a lot of experience working in the field, perhaps at a museum, they're a museum professional, they work at a library, library professional, or they might be an independent consultant, they do folklore or some sort of other public humanities-based work. And the other would be sort of, I'd say like a bearer of community knowledge. So someone who may or may not have an advanced degree as well, but is kind of considered by the community to kind of be a font of knowledge and experience that people would kind of go to. So these are all the kinds of different profiles. We don't require that everybody in the project team member have a PhD, for example. You're just kind of looking at how everyone's experiences kind of complementing each other holistically, and that their expertise in either certain practices, subject matters are kind of well aligned with the goals of the project. Now, I think I might see a question in the chat. This is a good question. So do all the project team members need to be located in New Jersey? No, they do not. So we do not have a requirement that all project team members need to be based in New Jersey. Really what we're looking more for is how this project benefits New Jersey-based audiences. And that is actually a good segue to our next subject. So does anybody have any questions before I move on? All right. Okay. Next, audience and outreach. So one of the things we're looking for is that you have a clearly defined audience or audiences. It's not really a requirement that your projects serve the general public. It can. Sometimes the most impactful programs will serve a narrow audience as well. So, I think sometimes too, it's helpful to think maybe in terms of like primary or secondary audiences. I remember talking to one organization that wanted to, create an exhibit. And, as they were thinking through this, they're like, well, primarily we're visited by, fourth grade students. So I think, okay, well, that's the primary audience. So really kind of how a lot of how they design the content of the project was sort of geared towards, fourth grade audience in mind, which is very different than a high school audience or older adult audience. So we the formulation that they came up with was the primary audience, what they're mainly going to gear toward, the primary visitorship is going to be fourth grade students. However, there also is a contingent of, family, tourists, etc. So they kind of considered that as their sort of secondary audience, but really they were designing the project towards a sort of fourth grade audience. One of the things that we're looking for is that projects are co-designed with the audiences. So how do you kind of consider the needs and interests of the audience or audiences throughout this project? This is often something, this can be a really crucial part of an incubation grant. Part of that can be, as you're sort of developing your project plan, is kind of meeting with audience, representatives of the audiences. Perhaps like you work with different organizations that represent different groups in your community that you'd want to work with. Perhaps you do surveys or focus groups with them. These are all things that you could support through the incubation grant, for example, and kinds of as you're developing your project plan. I think oftentimes when you're at the action stage, a lot of this would have been kind of figured out, but I think what we'll really be looking for is how you articulated, how you kind of arrived at these premises. So for example, if you want to do an exhibit, so what led you to this conclusion that this was the sort of the best method, that there was a real true interest, the best method of interacting with this audience, that there was a clear interest in the subject matter or this topic within the community. So that could be, for example, you could talk about we did focus groups, or throughout the years we've collected anecdotal evidence and determined, that, there's often very interest in this. So we saw a real unmet need in the community. Or through collecting surveys over the years, a consistent theme was, that, this need was unmet in our community. So, I mean, there's many ways to go about it, but I think one of the things that we'd be looking, that's going to make a really competitive proposal is kind of thinking about how you, kind of how what has led you to the different conclusions that make you think that this is kind of the best way to kind of interact with our intended audience. We're really looking to serve underrepresented audiences in the humanities. This is a wide array of groups, BIPOC, LGBTQ+, rural populations as well. There's a real, sort of rural urban divide in terms of access to the humanities. So I think, some counties, tend to get less funding, overall in the cultural infrastructure, Cumberland County or Sussex County, for example. So I think, there's many different ways to think about, underrepresented audiences. I think, one thing kind of clarifies too is that, it could be, young adults as well. I think one thing that I wanted to kind of discuss too, since there are generally a lot of college and university, applications from academic institutions, primarily colleges and universities, is that for those projects to be competitive, we're really looking for that these projects kind of move beyond the college and university classrooms and kind of engage with the broader public. And that can be through a variety of factors, whether you're, co-designing programming with, members of the community. It can involve, when you're at the implementation stage, actually hosting programming off campus, like you could instead go to the public library to host the programming. So there's kind of many different strategies for that as well. And I think too, what we're looking for is that you have a clear strategy for connecting with the audience or audiences that you're looking to engage to the project. And that goes beyond just like social media or building a website. I think in some ways, like social media is a given. You think about, do you have relationships with community groups that you could kind of leverage? Or, part of that might be, the grant might be actually building those relationships. Is like, okay, we see a real unmet need, I know some changes have, some townships have had like significant demographic changes, over the last 20 or so years, 20, 40 years. So, perhaps, you want to work with a, Hispanic, Latinx sort of groups in your community. So, you could be reaching out. Are there community groups like social service groups, religious groups, that your organization could engage with to kind of help build those bridges and begin building those bridges and relationships to kind of figuring out how to create programming for these audiences. So with that, I will stop again for questions if anybody has any questions for me.
One more quick point related to audience and outreach.
Mm-hmm.
I think a foundational part of everything that James is talking about is you should not make assumptions that we know who your priority audiences are, that we know how you connect with them, or that there is any obvious and definite way to connect with them. So the application offers you the opportunity to define all of that and make that very clear to us. As James said, it doesn't help us understand your strategy if you just say we're going to advertise on social media.
This is Marion.
Oh, hi, Marion.
Sorry.
That's okay. It doesn't help us to know just that you're going to advertise on social media. Most organizations do. This becomes a much more robust and interesting thing to say, we find that when we advertise on Facebook, we get great uptick, and we know this because of these numbers that we can provide. And we know that this particular audience that we're looking to reach out to has a lot of presence in our area because they have 3 Facebook groups and we are going to advertise with all of them. In other words, what I'm saying here is specificity is really helpful in making your proposal stand out, be relevant, and be competitive in these areas. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Gigi. That's a great point. I would say that actually applies broadly. Just generally don't make assumptions that, our reviewers, you really have any kind of deep knowledge about your organization, the context that you operate in, your programming, or the kind of history. We do try to provide information as much as possible, but we're not sort of on, all knowing either, and we can clearly miss things. So I think it's best if there are things that you think would be important for the evaluators to know. I think it's just, it's important not to make any assumptions about baseline knowledge, really, kind of about anything. So I think it's always helpful to kind of define your terms. All right, now getting into the budget aspect, budgeting capacity. So one of the things I would like to mention is that these are matching grants. So for every dollar you request, you'll need to match that by $1. That match can be either cash or in kind. Cash would be money that comes from your organization's operating budget, perhaps from another grant. Though I will note that you can't use NEH grants to match our funding, but you can use other grants. If you have any questions about that, though, feel free to reach out. But matches can also be in kind. So in kind contributions would be the estimated value of donated goods and services, including volunteer time. So that is something often too we see people kind of vastly underestimate is the amount of volunteer time that it takes. And I think I want to kind of emphasize this because we work with a variety of organizations from large research universities to small nonprofits that have no they're entirely volunteer run. So while we require that you have a match, it can be cash or in kind. If you're a university, it's probably going to be primarily a cash match. If you're a small volunteer run nonprofit, you'll probably have exclusively or primarily in kind match for your funds, and that's fine. You can use in-kind match to match the entire award. There's not really any kind of formula. I think sometimes people are under the misperception that they need to match every expense with both cash and in-kind contributions, which is not true. So you can kind of split it up, whatever makes sense for the sort of based on the kind of context of your organization and your financial circumstances. We're looking for the costs are reasonable and appropriate. So I think what we're looking for is a good faith estimate in terms of like what you're going to need to accomplish the project. I think we have space within there too to kind of help you make a case for why costs are reasonable and appropriate. So you can provide backup information, your calculations, if there's any other kind of information that you think would be sort of necessary to relay to the evaluators that you've kind of thought through your budget. I think a lot of people sometimes there's a tendency sometimes to put a lot of focus on the narrative, which the narrative is important, but ultimately this is a request for money. And I think the budget often gives a lot of insight into an organization's ability to kind of plan and kind of see. Now, obviously this is a plan and plans change, and this is something that will happen. So I think at this point we're just looking for that you've kind of made an informed, good faith, sort of reasonable assessment of like what you will need financially to accomplish the objectives of your project plan that you outline in the narrative. It's really important too that the budget matches the narrative. There should be kind of a clear through line of like, okay, I understand why you're requesting this funds, to kind of give an extreme example. I remember one grant requested $10,000 for buses, but there was no mention of buses anywhere in their proposal. So you're kind of left scratching your head of like, okay, well, why do they need $10,000 for buses? Like, this is a local walking tour. I don't really see the need for that. So that, that grant wasn't funded, and otherwise the narrative was really strong. So I think, it's really important to kind of think about how your budget aligns with the narrative. As I mentioned, one way we look at organization capacity is kind of like actually looking at the budget. Like, have they kind of, have they put thought into kind of what cost? Do they have a clear understanding of like what kind of costs will be necessary to do that? I think also looking at capacity is that kind of question that what I raised before in the project plan section is like, what is a reasonable amount of does your organization kind of have the capacity to kind of accomplish what you set out in the scope of work? And that's going to be different for every organization. But, I think that's kind of why it's often important to think about, be realistic and very specific and focused. Sometimes, particularly if you have less experience, with grants, is thinking about, okay, like, maybe we don't have the capacity to do 7 different things within a year, but we could do one thing really well. And so that kind of gets into the capacity question as well. So these are the kind of different questions that the evaluators will be considering as they evaluate your proposal. As I say, as Gigi mentioned, I think it's really important not to make assumptions about evaluator knowledge. And so kind of any information that you can provide into kind of helping make the case for why your organization and your project is very useful. So with that, I'm going to stop for a moment and thank you for putting in. There's a really valuable link that Gigi put in, which is independent sector, the value of volunteer time. So we recommend that you use that rate. We actually include it in the application as well, so that you can look at it when you're, you have a reference of it when you're kind of creating your budget. Volunteer time in New Jersey is volunteered about like $30 an hour currently, I believe. So that's the rate we recommend that you use. So, you could use that, as your, and towards your in-kind match. So does anybody have any questions about anything I've discussed so far?
There's a question in the chat that I'm going to read out loud. It says, what should we tell partner and potential collaborating organizations about the extent of their commitment?
All right, well, that's a very good question. I think that's going to be very different depending kind of on the context of each organization and your circumstances. I guess, would you mind unmuting yourself? Is there anything else that you think what would be helpful to kind of relay to kind of help answer that question? Because I think there's many kind of different directions that you should go. I think you are asking, I know sometimes it can be, are you kind of discussing, I know that sometimes this comes up with when I'm talking to, prospective applicants, is that, it's sort of the chicken and egg scenario, is like they might need commitments from people, but it's harder sometimes to get the commitment without knowing whether the funding is secured. Is that kind of the question you're getting at, or is that something different?
I was thinking that, so I'm basically in the position of providing a service, a platform for content producing groups. And that's kind of my role. But the thing is, for another organization to collaborate with me as a partner, it has to be run past their board, and their questions are immediately, what kind of obligations are we incurring? So I guess that's basically it. Organizations sometimes reluctant to partner.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally like that's less of a relationship that we're going to mediate as an organization. It would be important to kind of understand, the scope of what we can and cannot fund as an organization, and kind of relaying those commitments to the organization. But I think in terms of like, they're not going to have to sign any agreements to kind of be a partner with your organization. A lot of that is going to kind of come from your end. But I think, it's going to be still important to kind of have a particular understanding of like what is restricted around kind of expenditures in terms of how you support those organizations. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't know, Gigi, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is so project specific that maybe I would say there's a couple of things that kind of immediately come to mind besides what James has already said, which I think is wise. There is the fact that you should only apply for a grant for work that you are definitely going to do. Definitely going to be committed to do. You do ultimately in the end sign an agreement to spend this funding as you designate in your grant agreement in your grant proposal. And of course, plans change. Of course, there's developments along the way, et cetera, but in generally speaking, you should apply for grant funding for a project that you are prepared to do in the way that you describe it in the grant funding. There's a little more flexibility on that in incubation grants in a lot of cases because they are about planning and development. People have used incubation grants to explore partnerships, for example. The other thing I want to just briefly mention, if you have already started an application to NJCH, you know that one of the things we offer is one-on-one consultations. And that's my final suggestion, which is this is the kind of thing that we're going to want to talk about in specific rather than in general terms. And that's hard to do in an information session like this. So I would say if you want to talk about your project specifically, it's a good thing sooner rather than later to schedule a time to speak to James about this or to me.
Yeah, let's find a time to meet one-on-one, Phil. Yeah, because I think we need to get a little bit more into the weeds in terms of like your specific scenario here. So Brian asked a question. Following up on that question,
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. How important are letters of support from partners, potential partners? I mean, they're not necessary. They can be helpful though, in kind of, sort of making it clear, that these partnerships are not, they're not theoretical. There's substantive sort of, there's commitment from them, and that they're willing to kind of and provide evidence of that support. So it is often very helpful. It's not necessary in every case, I would say, but I would say if you can get them, I would recommend including them for sure. Anybody else have any questions? All right, move on. All right, so what makes a proposal competitive? I mean, one is it matches our funding priorities. I mentioned before, we are a public humanities funder. So we're looking for projects that center the humanities and make them accessible to diverse public audiences. We're not a scholarly organization. So if your programming kind of has, a focus towards a more limited scholarly audience, it's not going to be competitive. Or if it's not really engaged with the humanities in kind of any substantive way, it's not going to be really competitive either. We're really looking for a clear project description. This gets into the what. So what are you doing? Ultimately we are funding the what in many cases, so it's important to kind of have outline. It's like, okay, what are you specifically going to be doing with these funds over the next year? I think sometimes, I see applicants where it's a longer project time period, like maybe this is a 2, 3, 5-year project. And sometimes what I see is people describe the 5 years, but not really describing with like what they're going to do in the next year. And so I think it's really important, like, what are you specifically going to be doing? And what are you going to be specifically doing over the next year? You can, if this is part of a longer term project, great. And I think it's often helpful to provide that context, but not to lose sight of that you're ultimately kind of requesting funds from us for a very discrete time-bound project, and kind of explaining what you'll be doing in that time period. Now we're looking at sort of the value to the audience. Is why does this project serve their needs and interests? Why, and then that's kind of corollary to why your organization. So why is your organization doing this as well? So kind of getting a sense for like, how does this project like serve the needs and interests of your audiences? Like, why specifically are you doing this project? And then also kind of because we want to fund projects where there's kind of alignment, like we, with, we don't require that organizations have, a mission in the public humanities. We work with a variety of organizations that are, arts organizations, community development organizations, but really like, what kind of value are you getting from working with the humanities in terms of like, how is this building your organization up? I think sometimes too, going back to the what is, people often really sometimes focus, the why is important, but I think sometimes people sometimes might focus, a lot on the why without describing the what, like kind of describing a lot of the theory behind it. And sometimes they might focus, like what's the value to themselves or the organization, but not really describing, sort of what they're specifically going to do with the funding. So all these things are important, but if you kind of have any questions about kind of how to balance them, I'd be happy to answer them for you. As I mentioned, kind of, did I go too far? Yes. Okay. So this is why proposals, this is what makes proposals competitive. Now we say, why are proposals not funded? Lacks significant humanities focus. So it's not engaged with the humanities, not engaged with the public, does not involve the audience really in kind of its conception or execution, and does not really, always match our, match our audience priorities and kind of, seeking to reach out to kind of diverse and underrepresented audiences within the humanities. I mentioned this before, narrative and budget don't match. That's one significant reason why proposals are not funded. Project plan is not clear. So it's really unclear what, the organization is looking to do with the funds within the time period. Also, does not follow guidelines. I know sometimes reading the guidelines can be a little bit dry. There's a fair amount of text. So you try to make them as accessible as possible. And if you have questions about things and are unclear to you, definitely please let us know. But we've had grants not get funded because they didn't follow the guidelines. Our primary funder, the NEH, puts specific restrictions on what we can and cannot fund through our grants. And sometimes people request these expenses, and that's why they don't get funded. Like requesting $10,000 for fundraising expenses, which is not something we could support, through our project-based grants. So it's really important to kind of understand, what's in the guidelines. Really, I think the budget section or the use of funds section in the guidelines is really significant piece of that in terms of, what you can and cannot use our grants for. And really the number one reason we proposals are not funded is we run out of funding. Our grants are fairly competitive. We have close to $940,000 in grants in this round for about $225,000 in funding. So, we're probably looking at funding around, 30% or so of the proposals that are submitted. So yeah, our grants are fairly competitive, so, we always run out of money before we run out of good projects to fund. So we always have to kind of make some really challenging decisions. If your proposal is not funded, I will say that we do provide feedback. So that's something you can request from us. We will provide feedback. We can meet with us, provide written feedback, or you can meet with us one-to-one to discuss your proposal. And with that, I want to close off with some important dates. So we're doing draft review again. So the deadline for drafts is April 10th at 11:59 p.m. In your LOI acceptance email, I set instructions on how to submit your draft proposal, but kind of as a quick summary, just send an email to grants@njhumanities.org with either PDF, Word document of your grant. We don't require full proposals, complete proposals for draft review. I will say that, if you are unable to finish the full proposal, oftentimes a partial narrative in a budget is more useful than just a complete narrative, since we can kind of, as I said, sometimes these decisions really come down to kind of how funds are utilized. So it's really important for us to get a sense for the budget. If you can complete the whole thing, great. So just send us an email to grants@njhumanities.org. We'll typically provide written feedback. It can be scheduled into meetings, though with the amount of prospective applicants, it will be probably impossible for me to meet with everybody, for Gigi and I to meet with everybody who's applying in this round. We have 75 applicants. So I definitely say, if you have kind of significant questions that you need to discuss, please reach out to us. We'll do our best to meet with you. Whether it's a short, quick conversation or a longer meeting to discuss something. So the draft deadline is again April 10th. We'll try to do as quick turnaround as possible. April 18th is our final application deadline at 11:59 p.m. We will notify you of our decision by June 30th, and projects can begin between July 1st to September 30. I meant to say September 30th, not September 31st, because that date doesn't exist. So anyway, that is kind of the rundown of the process this year, of the sort of important dates and deadlines upcoming. I see, is there a question in the chat?
Aaron was asking about, do we usually fully fund the amount requested, or is there any additional feedback around that?
That's a good question. Our preference is to provide full funding. However, we're not able to do that in every circumstances. There are times where we do provide partial awards to organizations, just so we can kind of distribute funding more, more widely. Yeah, so that's kind of something that's usually a question that comes up, in terms of, trying to think about this, yeah. I don't know if you have anything you want to add about that, Gigi.
Nope, you got it. We very rarely fund less than about 80%.
Yeah, if we do provide partial, yeah, it's typically, 90% range.
90%. The other place where we occasionally see partial funding is if there are discrete pieces of a project that we're willing to fund and not other discrete pieces. This very rarely comes up, but let's say your project had 3 parts to it, and we were able to fund 2 out of 3, and it was very clearly delineated in your budget. We might go into that under very specific circumstances. And then the final one, occasionally we pull a grant fund, an award down based on a general project that we do want to fund, but there's a specific line that we can't fund. Usually that's an eligibility question. If you included, purchase of alcohol, for example, that is something that's not able to be funded. But if otherwise the project was great, then we would just pull off that $500 or whatever it was.
All right. Now, with that, so I have my contact information up here. grants@njhumanities.org is the best email. It goes to both Gigi and I. We'll do our best to answer your questions as quickly as possible. My direct line is 609-695-4303. I'd ask if I do not answer the phone, which I'm not able to in every circumstance because I'm often in phones or meetings, please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And also njhumanities.org/grants is a resource that's available 24/7. So if you have any questions about our grants, often it can be answered there. So we still have some time left. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stick around to see if you have any questions.
James, you okay if I stop recording?
Oh yeah, we should stop recording. I'll do it.